and welcome to the second episode of the best book review show ever. If you're new to this channel, thanks for stopping by. And if you're returning, we appreciate your support. On today's episode, we'll be reviewing Fourth Wing and Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros. There's a lot of hype surrounding these two books, and I just finished Iron Flame earlier this week, so we'll be reviewing them both. These reviews are separated into 5 sections. The timestamps are located in the description below. This intro is the first section, a spoiler-free review is the second section, a compliment sandwich is the third section, and that's going to have some spoilers. So this is your first spoiler warning. If you don't wish for the story to be spoiled, I recommend skipping the third section. The fourth section is the score section, and the last section is the outro. That's where I decide whether or not I recommend the book and what kind of audience I think would appreciate the book most. With the intro out of the way, let's get to the review. All of my book reviews will be focusing my judgment upon 5 main categories. And as a fair warning, there will almost never be a perfect 10 in any category. Art is never truly finished. At some point, we simply choose to stop working on it. The 5 categories are: number 1, prose/world building. For these book reviews, we rely on this definition: the ordinary language that the writer uses to directly convey and communicate the world, concepts, ideas, characters, and story to the reader. I include in this category how well the author was able to maintain immersion, their ability to paint a compelling mental picture for the reader, as well as how easy or difficult it is to digest their writing. Category number 2, pacing, which, defined in these reviews, is how well the timing and momentum of the story feel, chapter by chapter, how well each paragraph and each chapter propels the story forward, and if there's any unnecessary verbal fluff stagnating the momentum. Category 3, character development. I believe this category is self-explanatory, but for the sake of the audience, I'll define it in my own terms. How well the story depicts the meaningful growth of individual characters from their introduction into the story until the story ends. Category 4, foreshadowing and plot. I love to see how well authors developed the plot with foreshadowing and hide the solution to the plot with those early hints. This kind of forethought keeps me turning pages and buying more and more books of the series. The 5th and last section, the motif. What underlying concepts were consistent throughout the story? How well were they communicated? What was the main motif? And how well did it culminate meaningfully by the end of the story? Category 1, world building and prose. Can I just say, wow, I did not expect for the world that Rebecca Yarros built to be so bloody awesome. I was worried that because it had become so mainstream that these books would be disappointing, but I'm happy to say that I only found it lacking in the slightest, and I can see why there's so much hype around these 2 books. I do believe that these books were more suited to a specific audience, namely a female one, but even as a male, I thought it was extremely well done. The characters all seem very believable, most of them with a unique enough personality, although I will say that at first it was kind of hard to keep track of every single character, but I think it actually helps with the immersion. The setting takes place in a military academy, and from my own time in the military, I can say at first it's difficult and overwhelming to remember everybody's names and faces. A little bit of critique as far as the conversational prose. It's very modern. That is to say, she drops a lot of F-bombs and hits and whatnots in her writing. I would have liked to see a more unique and creative way to pronounce and create invectives, something unique to the world that makes more sense. You know, in the world of Aragon, for example, they use Brissinger. There's nothing like that in these books, and I would have liked to see some of those invectives created for this own unique world. Interesting bit about the curse word F-U-C-K. It came from an acronym in Old English times. Back then, everyone who was a king's citizen was literally and legally considered the king's property. So, if someone wanted to have intercourse before marriage, one had to ask the king's consent. The written consent of the king was called the right to fornicate under consent of the king, which is where we got the invective F-U-C-K. In this world that Rebecca Yarros has created, sex seems to be a more casual thing in her world. So I'm not sure if they would have had the same cultural history for the word. But yeah, as far as world building and her ability to convey the world, magic system, the culture of the different breeds of dragons and their relationship with humans, it was very well done. The biggest critique I have is the conversational prose and her ability to write action. I found myself having to reread some of the action scenes just to really understand and paint a clear picture in my head, but I think she got more effective at writing this, especially towards the end of Fourth Wing, the first book. And throughout all of Iron Flame, I didn't have this problem as much. Her ability to write action scenes had definitely progressed. Her strength is definitely in the detailed descriptions of intercourse. So if you like spicy sex scenes, as in 50 Shades of Grey, then you will love this book. I think she relied a little too much on this. One or two scenes of this was enough for my taste, but if you enjoy reading graphic, detailed descriptions of intercourse, you'll probably enjoy this, especially if it's coming from a female perspective. Immersion was well maintained throughout the story, but if you're a more advanced reader who's been reading fantasy for years and years, you probably will not like the conversational prose as much. Category 2. Pacing. The pacing was well done. I will say edges close to outstanding. Each of the two books has a timeline of about 1 year, and there are very few chapters without at least some kind of action. Sure, there are a lot of chapters of them just sitting in class, but she keeps it very interesting, and Rebecca Yarros is great at creating and ramping up tension meaningfully, even in that classroom setting. She drops little tidbits of information while they're in class to help you kind of pick and garner pieces of the world meaningfully. There's almost always something propelling the story forward, even when they are just in class or sparring. Whether she's letting the reader learn more and more about dragons, or the history and the nature of the world, how the academy functions, the politics of the world, or how it came to be, Rebecca Yarros does a great job of keeping a good pace while describing the world to you. Section 3. Character development. I was impressed. Many fantasy writers, myself included, struggle with finding ways to depict meaningfully character development. But Rebecca Yarros does a really great job. I don't want to spoil too much in this section, but the main character has immense growth from the beginning of the first book to the end of the second book, and that growth is meaningful even from the beginning of the first book to the end of the first book, and even more growth from the beginning of the second book to the end of the second book. It's very believable and very realistic as far as traumas and stresses of being in a military academy, dealing with death, watching comrades die by your side, and how meaningfully convey the traumas of battle, and how that will be a catalyst for growth for any character. Death is in all too real inevitability, and she does a great job of maintaining the traumas and stresses from the first book and developing the character meaningfully even more in the second book. Perhaps my only real critique in this aspect is some of the supporting characters kind of stay the same throughout the story. And I get it. They don't necessarily go into battle the way the main character does early on. So they don't have those same stressors that force them to develop the character meaningfully in a short amount of time. But I would have liked to see some descriptive language expanding on who these supporting characters were in the beginning and also how they grew. This is addressed some in depth in the second book. Even the dragons grow and develop in character, and I'm eager to see how she addresses this further in the third book. Section 4, Foreshadowing and Plot. Wow, Rebecca Yarros may not be as strong in other categories, but she's a talent worth recognizing in this category. She foreshadows so much with very little effort very early on in the first book, and it comes back around into the second book meaningfully. She is very capable of building up small elements planted early on in the story and developing them slowly without giving away too much, but just enough to keep you thinking, keep you wondering, is this going to come back later? And it does. Even by the end of the first book, she had subverted my expectations thoroughly, and I was very happily surprised enough with the end of the first book to buy the second book right away and continue reading. Section 5, Motif. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of recurring, meaningful themes going on in these books. They all kind of intertwine with each other, but I'm going to try my best to untangle some of these complex ideas and see if I can find at least one of the main motifs here in these reviews. From the beginning of the story to the end, the possibility of death and facing it without succumbing to crippling fear is a huge part of the story. It's one of the devices that Rebecca Yarros uses very effectively in creating and maintaining tension. Government conspiracies, the government lying to the people for the best interest of all, and whether or not the people have a right to know and decide for themselves also plays a large part in the story. I thought this was brilliant, very realistic, and I love how it felt, especially after the turmoil of the last few years that we've experienced here in the United States. This tied into doing what's right, even if it means going against what the government says. Another meaningful motif was trust in one's partner, whether romantic or their dragon or even their squad mates. This was a recurring theme, and trust was not something to be taken lightly, even within a certain quadrant or even within someone that you had grown up with, for example. How well you could trust them and how easily that trust could be broken once betrayed, and how difficult it is to rebuild that trust after it's been betrayed. We're moving into the third section of the video. This is your final warning. There are more spoilers ahead, so if you do not wish for some of the elements of the story to be spoiled, skip ahead using the timestamps in the description below to the fourth section of this video. There, I will give the score with little or no spoilers. But in this section, I will be doing a compliment sandwich, and there will be a lot of spoilers ahead. So please, if you do not wish for the story to be spoiled meaningfully, then I recommend that you skip this section and use the timestamps below to move forward to the fourth section of the video. The good. Alright, let's admit it. The hype around these books is very well deserved. Rebecca Yarros successfully created a fantasy that seems like the love child between Aragon, Harry Potter, and 50 Shades of Grey. She's ruthless with the realism of death during wartime. Her magic system is well crafted, tied to being bonded with dragons and the wild magic of the land. The description of her lovemaking scenes stirs primal arousal and can easily be a guilty pleasure. I think this is her biggest writing strength. Anyone who loves books filled with dragons, magic, war, death, romance, and epic plot twists of clandestine government conspiratorial nature will love this book. Some of the characters are ridiculously powerful and just, well, quite frankly, cool. It's hard not to like the love interest, even if you're a guy and you want to hate him. He's awesome. The world, villains, main plot are all just compelling and well crafted. It's hard not to wish you could be bonded to one of these dragons, even if it means the very likely possibility of dying. Sure, her conversational prose may not be as good as someone like Robert Jordan or Naomi Novik, but her ability to create a story that can represent young women in today's modern age, I think she's very relatable, and her ability to craft a beautiful world with a meaningful plot and conflict, she did an outstanding job. The hype behind these books is real. Will it stand the test of time? We'll see. But for now, if you have someone that enjoys Aragon, 50 Shades of Grey, and Harry Potter, they would probably like these books. The not so good. At least in the first book, her description of action scenes needed some improvement, and to her credit, she greatly improved into the second book. But in the first book, I had to reread some of the fight scenes in order just to paint a clear picture in my head. Action scenes are really hard to do, especially if you haven't spent a good amount of time sparring or practicing hand-to-hand combat yourself. I touched on this earlier, but the conversational prose for the main character just isn't that good. In my humble opinion, she should have been way less modern. The way her thoughts read is something too edgy, too rash, too immature for someone of her intellect. I'm not going to use too many examples, but here's an example. There's many points in the story where you're looking into her thoughts and she reads like what the fuck. It's just not very poetic and it's not very eloquent. I think if you created your own invectives and if maybe you made her a little more mature as she should be for her intellect, then she wouldn't be thinking things like this. It kind of makes it feel like the book is written for teenagers rather than for adults. But then she'll have these very graphic and detailed sex scenes that border on soft porn. I would never recommend this book for anyone, female or male, under the age of 17 or 18. Another thing, admittedly, it's hard to avoid this, and eventually Rebecca Yarros finds a meaningful way to do so at the end of the second book, but it definitely feels like the main characters kind of have plot armor. I know, kind of a shitty thing to nitpick at, but there were at least 2 times where I was like, yeah, the main character definitely should have died there, but it wasn't egregious enough to break immersion, so I didn't think too much of it. But for the sake of these reviews, I thought I'd at least bring it up. The whole love interest being hot, steamy, mysterious, shadow-wielding rebel who has a dark past and darkness inside with a 10-pack abs, it seems very cliche. Really, he's a good guy, and it was kind of an overused trope, but she developed the character well enough that he was likable enough and real enough for me to like him. Although I still feel like this is coming too much from a female perspective, a female idealistic view of the hottest guy possible with a sense of mystery and darkness within. Now let's get into the great parts of her writing and the great parts of the book. Its pacing and compelling plot kept me turning pages and devouring chapters. As much as I hated those other cliche parts of the book and the immature modern perspective of the main character's thoughts, something about standing up to a corrupt government in order to save the continent from imminent danger looming on the horizon kept me not just enthralled, but hanging on the edge of my seat, turning page after page and wanting to find out what would happen. The frequent deaths of characters that she built up also helped to maintain a realistic immersion and a feel of realism that even if the two main characters had plot armor, people and dragons were dying around them in war. It felt realistic. Again, I'm gonna go back to this a little bit, but this is, I think, part of Rebecca Yarros' talent. If you like spicy sex scenes, this is one of her strengths, especially coming from a female perspective. Let's move on from that though. I loved how clever the main character is, using her intellect to find creative solutions, loopholes, using her knowledge of flora to give her advantage in fights despite her size disadvantage was outstanding. And it's not like it was unrealistic. The main character had spent more time than any other dragon rider reading during her youth, so it was very believable that her knowledge and intellect would be so high. Another great part of the story was that I'd never read dragons and their different breeds described in a way that Rebecca Yarros has created. I thought it was beautifully done. The way she describes baby dragons and the different colors signifying different lines of families and breeds and the different tales was super creative. So very well done. Bravo. I think anybody who ever wants to write a dragon book needs to read this. Maybe not necessarily to learn prose or foreshadowing, but if anything, just to learn about how you can creatively and meaningfully make your own version of different dragon breeds. This is a prime example. Well done. Rebecca Yarros is probably a master of foreshadowing. She's still young and has a long way to go to develop, but there were things in the beginning of the first book that came back at the end of the first book that subverted even my expectations. I had no idea some of these elements or characters would come back by the end of the first book, and I was pleasantly surprised every time. I was extremely impressed with even some of the things that were foreshadowed in the first book coming around into the second book. It was truly outstanding. One last thing about the great about Rebecca Yarros and these books. The grumpy, disciplinarian, military mom who seems cold and distant, sacrificing herself for her daughter, was probably one of the best devices used in all of the two books. It was a very subtle device at first, and she built it up over the course of both books, and if she had done this at the end of the first book, we as readers probably wouldn't have felt much for the character. I think there could have been a little more development there, but I still think this was outstanding. It was a very realistic portrayal of what a mom is. It's a parent's duty to prepare one for the world and sacrifice oneself if need be. When it happened, the payoff was huge, especially since more interactions with the mom into the second book, and we kind of garnered a more intimate understanding of why she did things the way she did, despite the main character constantly reinforcing the idea that the mom was too callous from combat to care. The doubts in the main character's head about her mom felt very real, and very relatable in the context of her unique situation. As someone with a dad who's out there right now in the desert fighting for our freedoms, I can relate. I can understand. So if we're going to talk about the great of Rebecca Yarros, this is something that she encapsulated completely. Well written, well done. So if you're a military brat or you have a military parent and you want something that you can relate to, and you're 17, 18, 19, 20 up until 25, I think you will resonate with this kind of book. We're moving on to section 4. I said this last time, but I'm gonna say it again, and I'm probably gonna say it again in every video. But my thoughts and opinions on art are subjective, just like anybody else's. There will almost never be a perfect score for any work of art. I'm comparing these works based on other fantasy series I've read. And the only way I would ever give a 10 out of 10 is if it's the best thing I've read thus far. So keep in mind that any score 30 and above is still outstanding. Let's get into the score section. For the prose and world building, I'm going to deduct some points here for prose. The world building was great. Immersion was well kept and still great. Some unique invectives would have made this story better. And as I said before, some of the conversational prose or reading into some of the inner working mind of the main character felt lacking or a little juvenile. So for that, I'm gonna give 6.5. Category 2, the pacing. The pacing throughout the story felt really good. I don't really have too many critiques about the pacing other than I would have liked less time talking about how hot the love interest is, maybe fewer scenes of love making. They were described really well. I think anybody who loves that kind of stuff will really enjoy that. I think in this regard, less is more. There were many chapters love making, and I think there was entirely too much time devoted to describing spicy sex, but Rebecca Yarros still made sure to propel the story forward, at least in some fashion, after, before, or during those sex scenes. So for that, I'll give her a 7.5. Category 3, character development. I think this is one of the categories where Rebecca Yarros shines. The main character and most of the supporting characters all experience a wide range of meaningful, realistic growth. Stresses and traumas of war are a great catalyst for change, and other writers like myself can really learn and draw inspiration from this. So we're going to give her an 8.5. Category 4, foreshadowing and plot. One of Rebecca Yarros' strengths, she's able to build an outstanding and well thought out plot. By the end of the second book, you'll certainly be aching for more, just like I was. I personally cannot wait to see how she ties up the rest of the series, and I greatly look forward to how she develops as a writer, because it's damn impressive how compelling the conflict is and how well she foreshadowed it so much without giving too much away. She may not be a master at prose or pacing, but the two places where her talent shows is character development and her ability to create a beautiful plot, and how she's able to foreshadow that plot. It was riveting. I would love to see these books as movies. Very well done. 8.5. Last section, motif. Another strength of Rebecca Yarros is tying in some realistic and meaningful concepts into her story. Not just the basic ones like trust in one's partner or parent, duty as a military servant to all people, but the big ones, like making the right choice, even if it means confronting the corruption of the government. And this hits home, especially in the past couple of years with everything that's been going on. The way she ties it up and the way she's able to depict the character's growth into this, and the way she foreshadows all of this and ties it up neatly into the end is beautiful. And the way she sets up plot with the motif from the first book into the second book is beautiful. This is her highest section. I give it a 9.0. So her final score, 40 out of 50 or 80%. If you disagree with some of my opinions or you have recommendations for book reviews, please leave a comment below and I'll do my best to get back to you. We made it to the end of the video. If you stayed for this long, thank you so much for sharing with me some of your time. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this. Now, do I recommend this book? 80 out of 100 is a pretty darn good score. So yeah, I do recommend these books. I would not recommend this book to anyone under the age of 17, as I think some of the graphic detailed sex scenes are a little much for someone of that age, and I would also not recommend it to anyone who really appreciates a more advanced reading level, as the conversational prose might be a little immature for their taste, but I still highly recommend these books. I think the intended audience was for females between the age of 17 and 35. They would probably appreciate these books the most, although I still appreciated and enjoyed them as a male. But these books are a great gift for anyone who's looking to get into fantasy and who enjoyed Harry Potter or Aragon. Now for the updates on my own book. I'm currently finishing chapter 22 sometime this week or early next week, and we'll be starting chapter 23 shortly after. We just finished editing chapter 21 and chapter 20. So, if you wish to donate to my own personal project, or you wish to support this channel, look for the Patreon link in this channel's description. One more thing, if you enjoyed the music that we have as ambiance for our videos, huge shout out and huge thank you to Bits and Hits for letting us use their music in our videos. I highly recommend that you go check out their channel. I'll leave the link in the description below. Go give them your support, give them a like and a follow. Thanks guys. I appreciate you sharing some of your time with me. It's our most valuable asset, so thank you. I look forward to seeing you in our next video. May the Great Mother guide you, and may the Great Father shine upon you. Till next time.